Thank you, Ken. That was just about the nicest introduction I've ever gotten. I can't thank you enough. It was much better than the introduction I gave myself. Several years ago, I was asked to do double duty by the National Archives when I was at the Hoover Library and asked to help organize the centennial of President Eisenhower's birth in Abilene, Kansas. And I went to Abilene, and it was the first time I met with a group. And I was trying to sort of define who I was and why I was there. And I said, well, you know, I've been a presidential freak since I was 6 years old. And be careful what you say. The next day, the paper's headline, "Freak to Run Eisenhower Centenary." First of all, thank you so much, not only for that introduction, but for your invitation. It is really an extraordinary honor to be here as part of the Schade Lecture series. When you look at the list of all those folks who have appeared on this stage, not only a great tribute to a great educator, but to Elmhurst itself. I had to come out here and find out if U.S. News and World Report was exaggerating, and I discovered that no, if anything, they're underestimating the caliber of this place and its people. It is a remarkable place, and no doubt much of the credit for that goes to your retiring president, Charles de Gaulle, who's a hero of mine. Not many other people, but you know, that's all right. We all get to have our heroes. Charles de Gaulle said that one must wait until the evening to see how splendid the day has been. I think in the case of Dr. and Mrs. Curitan, the day has been splendid indeed. I also am delighted that you're doing this as a joint venture with the Elmhurst Historical Museum. Happy 50th birthday. As someone who recently passed that milestone, I can tell you the best is yet to come. I only will take one exception. I noticed in the program it says I'm 54. That won't happen for 2 more days. So let me enjoy my being 53 as long as I can. In return for your hospitality this evening, I promise to keep in mind something Abraham Lincoln once said of a particularly long-winded Springfield lawyer, namely that he could compress the most words into the smallest ideas of any man he knew. With Lincoln himself, of course, quite the opposite is true. With a spare eloquence that has never been equaled, he once reminded his countrymen, quote, "We cannot escape history. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation." A century and a half later, it might be said that we cannot escape Lincoln. In anticipation of his forthcoming bicentennial, a wave of new books has yet to crest, making it plain that this is one historical figure about whom the last word will never be written. From Hollywood comes word that Steven Spielberg is about to do for Lincoln what he did earlier for E.T. and Indiana Jones. Then there is the small screen, having been enlisted in the past to market tea, automobiles, and life insurance. Our 16th president has more recently teamed up with a smart-mouthed beaver to help fight sleep deprivation. Is there any more universal figure than Abraham Lincoln? Show a grade school child in Beijing or Bloomington a stovepipe hat and whiskers. No further identification is required. Of course, recognition is not the same thing as understanding. Therein lies a problem and a possibility. For even as much of the world gropes its way toward that new birth of freedom he proclaimed at Gettysburg, Lincoln himself is in danger of becoming an icon, revered and remote, like Washington on his stony steed, summoned out of the historical mists each February to sell us used cars and appliances. In the words of David McCullough, the story of the real Abraham Lincoln has receded so far into the nation's memory that what remains seems little more than a dream. The real Abraham Lincoln. The search for this elusive quarry has been ongoing since at least 1832, when a 23-year-old giant as raw as the riverfront village to which he had recently moved first declared his intention to enter politics. "Every man is said to have his peculiar ambition," said Lincoln. "I have no other so great as that of being truly esteemed of my fellow men, by rendering myself worthy of their esteem. Thus he introduced himself to his New Salem neighbors. It cannot be said that the first-time candidate for the state legislature cut a very prepossessing figure on the campaign trail. A leathery-skinned giant with a floating left eye and size 14 feet, he wore a mixed jeans coat, recalled one voter, clawhammer style, short in the sleeves, and bobtail. In fact, it was so short in the back that he could not sit on it. Flax and tow linen pantaloons and a straw hat. Lincoln lost his first campaign for office, but not his desire to climb the greasy pole. He admitted as much to a friend years later. "You know better than any man living," said Lincoln, "that from my boyhood up my ambition was to be president." Which, you might ask, is the real Lincoln? The humble novice of New Salem or the confessional occupant of the White House? Harry Truman famously defined a statesman as a politician who's been dead for 20 years. Lincoln is both and more. He is at once the president against whom all others are measured and the most brilliant politician in American history. Now, I realize that for many of you, this is faint praise at best. In 2007, politicians as a class are held in somewhat lower regard than telemarketers. And if there are any telemarketers in the audience, don't take offense. You're probably actually more popular than politicians. The very word politics has come to be equated with attack ads and focus-grouped convictions, part of a dispiriting electoral process wherein candidates without ideas hire consultants without scruples to conduct campaigns without substance. The result, increasingly, is elections without voters. Today, millions of Americans of both parties and of no party feel alienated from the permanent campaign being waged by political handlers and spin doctors who all too often define success as exploiting our differences rather than narrowing them. What can Lincoln possibly have to do with this kind of politics? On the surface, very little. And yet, for much of his life, he was a loyal party functionary, a partisan whose sharp tongue was as likely to cut himself as his opponents. Indeed, when he spoke of a fiery trial, Lincoln might just as well have been describing his own permanent campaign, a lifelong effort to escape his rustic origins as a $10 a month flatboatman and earn at least a chance to be honorably remembered to the latest generation. Of course, if that was the whole of his story, or even its essence, we wouldn't be here this evening. We are here because of Lincoln's other campaign, a campaign to prove and improve himself, all the while vindicating ideas of individual opportunity and popular government in a world of despots and divine right. Needless to say, the idea of the image of Lincoln as political animal hardly squares with Carl Sandburg's dreamy idealist who halts in the middle of the road to rescue a pig stuck in the mud, or the upright store clerk who walks miles to return a few cents to an inadvertently shortchanged customer. In the 1930s, the great literary critic Edmund Wilson said that Carl Sandburg was the worst thing to happen to Abraham Lincoln since John Wilkes Booth. That's what literary critics do. Sandburg's Lincoln is summoned by destiny, not unlike his youthful hero George Washington. As a boy, Lincoln devoured Parson Weems' sugary biography of our first president, Cherry Tree, Dollar Hurled Across the Rappahannock and all, blissfully unaware that no man in America was less likely to throw money away than the tight-fisted father of his country. It made an indelible impression. As a result, no small part of what I call Lincoln's permanent campaign involved his dogged pursuit of the secular immortality bestowed on Washington and the founding generation. It isn't a pleasant thing to think that when we die, that is the last of us, Lincoln remarked to a New Salem acquaintance. Against the chill of mortality, he had only the fire of his own ambition. Even then, however, he was no garden variety office seeker. He could act no part but his own. According to his friend Joshua Speed, He copied no one, either in manner or style. For one thing, he was a rational man in an increasingly irrational country. He was still in his 20s when he told a Springfield audience, quote, "Passion has helped us, but can do so no more. It will in the future be our enemy. Reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason, must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense." This would prove to be prophetic. 4 terms in the state legislature honed his skills and raised his profile. He set his sights on higher office. To Joshua Speed, the would-be congressman, said in 1841 that he would be perfectly willing to die then and there. Quote, "But I have an inexpressible desire to live," he added, "at least till I can be assured that the world is a little better for my having lived in it." This is how politicians justify their ambition. Now, if you should hear anyone say that Lincoln don't want to go to Congress, he told a friend with somewhat greater candor, I wish you would tell him you have reason to believe he is mistaken. The truth is, I would like to go very much. When the prize went instead to a Whig rival, Lincoln made little effort to hide his bitterness. 3 years later, he resolved to try again. Following his victory in November 1846, he returned all but 25 cents of the $200 electioneering fund supplied him by the party organization, his campaign expenditures being limited to a single barrel of cider for the voters. By conventional standards, his first Washington career was not a success. To be sure, Lincoln displayed a shrewd grasp of political tactics. James Polk was in the White House, and Polk was the personification of manifest destiny. We don't remember Polk today. There's no particular reason to remember Polk today, except if you live in the Southwest or the Northwest or Mexico, because he added all of that, and he fought the Mexican War, a war which, by the way, Ulysses Grant, who fought in it, later said was the most unjustified war of aggression by a stronger power against a weaker ever. That's how Lincoln felt when he was in Congress. He was the only Whig congressman from Illinois, and he took an unpopular position. Polk had justified the war by claiming that the Mexicans had committed aggression against the United States. So Lincoln introduced something called the spot resolution. It's very simple. Dear Mr. President, would you please identify on this map the spot where Mexicans committed aggression? Needless to say, the White House wasn't thrilled. They managed to bottle it up. They had a majority in Congress. The interesting thing about that is you see Lincoln in transition. He's gotten his place in Congress. By the way, after he was elected, he told a friend, being elected hasn't given me as much pleasure as I had anticipated. He is a brilliant tactician, but he's also a man who's actually willing to take risks for principle. In this case, the principle that the Mexican War is wrong. He was very careful. By the way, his Springfield hometown newspaper compared him to Benedict Arnold. He was very careful, shades of today's headlines, to vote funds for the troops. But he was merciless in describing President Polk's conduct of the war. This is Abraham Lincoln, 160 years ago. As to the mode of terminating the war and securing peace, the president is equally wandering and indefinite. First, it is to be done by a more vigorous prosecution of the war in the vital parts of the enemy's country. And after apparently talking himself tired on this point, the president drops down into a half-despairing tone and tells us that with a people distracted and divided by contending factions and a government subject to constant changes by successive revolutions, the continued success of our arms may fail to secure a satisfactory peace. But soon he falls into doubt of this too, and then drops back on the already half-abandoned ground of more vigorous prosecution. All this shows that the president is in no wise satisfied with his own positions. First, he takes up one, and in attempting to argue us into it, he argues himself out of it. Then seizes another and goes through the same process. His mind, tasked beyond its power, is running hither and thither like some tortured creature on a burning surface, finding no position on which it can settle down and be at ease. You can imagine how popular that made Congressman Lincoln at the White House. You can also imagine how often that was quoted back to Lincoln 20 years later when he was in the White House. His gift for sarcasm may have delighted Whig partisans, but it alienated as many voters as it entertained. In 1848, the Democrats nominated an elderly Michigander named Lewis Cass to be their presidential candidate. That he had seen action in the distant War of 1812 was a fact his supporters never let the voters forget. Neither did Lincoln. "Did you know I'm a military hero?" said Lincoln. "Oh, yes, sir. In the days of the Black Hawk War, I fought, fled, and came away." Speaking of General Cass's career reminds me of my own. I was not at Stillman's defeat, but I was about as near as Cass was to Hull's surrender. And like him, I saw the place very soon afterward. It is quite certain I did not break my sword, for I had none to break. But I bent a musket pretty badly on one occasion. If General Cass went in advance of me in picking huckleberries, I guess I surpassed him in charges upon the wild onions. If he saw any live fighting Indians, it was more than I did. But I had a good many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes, and although I never fainted from the loss of blood, I can truly say I was often very hungry. In November, Cass went down to defeat at the hands of an authentic war hero named Zachary Taylor. Lincoln's own opposition to the war ensured that he would not win a second term. So he did what other involuntarily retired congressmen do. After a single term in office, he asked the White House for a job. When he failed to secure the position of commissioner of the General Land Office, he went home to Springfield, his political career in tatters. Had he died in 1849, or even 5 years later following his first unsuccessful campaign for the United States Senate, he would be little noted nor long remembered today. Under the circumstances, his relationship with Mary Todd of Lexington, Kentucky, might best be understood in terms instantly recognizable to 21st century audiences. Theirs was a political partnership. Miss Todd was a very unusual young lady. She loved politics. She loved the cut and thrust of the partisan arena. And of course, genteel young ladies, or even not so genteel young ladies, weren't supposed to sully their heads with such interests in the 1840s. So she lived, in many ways, vicariously through this man whom she was convinced was going to be President of the United States. What else brought them together? I often talk of Henry Clay as the matchmaker. Henry Clay, the great Kentucky statesman, was a friend of Mary's father, and he was Abraham Lincoln's political hero. So they had that in common as well. At first blush, the Lincolns appear as ill-matched as silk and sandpaper. On closer examination, their admittedly turbulent marriage confirms the old adage that opposites attract. Like a pair of high-spirited horses yoked in harness, they had to pull together if the coach of state was not to be upset. As fiercely loyal as a Nancy Reagan or Hillary Clinton, Mary Lincoln glimpsed a destiny visible to few others. That said, the Quaker Brown house at the corner of 8th and Jackson Streets in Springfield may well be considered the original house divided. There are too many contemporary accounts that have Mary striking her husband with a stick of wood, hurling hot coffee in his face, or driving him to take refuge on an extra long sofa in the offices of Lincoln and Herndon to be dismissed as mere neighborhood gossip. If he refused to be rattled by conflict in the White House, perhaps it was because he had learned to accept conflict in his own house. Quarrel not at all, he advised others. No man resolved to make the most of himself can spare time for personal contention. Lincoln would take his own advice, and in doing so, forge a presidency whose magnanimity was all the more remarkable given the hatred directed his way. Being only human, he wasn't immune to feelings of jealousy, especially where his perennial rival, Stephen A. Douglas, was concerned. With me, the race of ambition has been a failure, a flat failure, he wrote in a private memorandum. With him, it has been one of splendid success. All that was about to change. In January 1854, Senator Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act, effectively undoing the Missouri Compromise that limited the spread of slavery into the nation's territories. Overnight, Lincoln awoke from his political slumber. "Repeal the Missouri Compromise," he exclaimed. "Repeal all compromises. Repeal the Declaration of Independence. Repeal all past history. You still cannot repeal human nature. It still will be the abundance of man's heart that slavery's extension is wrong, and out of the abundance of his heart, his mouth will continue to speak." Out of the chrysalis of the 1850s emerged someone infinitely larger than the failed congressman and party wheelhorse. In those turbulent, transforming years, Lincoln found his voice and he found his moral compass. Indeed, one Lincoln scholar has gone so far as to label this a midlife crisis, with its subject morphing from party hack to statesman. Yet even statesmen, and I would argue especially statesmen, have need of political skills if he is to have any hope of realizing his vision. And make no mistake, Lincoln had a vision. There had never been a time, he said, when slavery did not have the power to make him miserable. In fact, he was still an infant when his parents joined an abolitionist branch of the Baptist Church. The family's subsequent move from Kentucky to Indiana was at least partly influenced by Thomas Lincoln's disdain for slavery. At the age of 19, his son first encountered the trafficking of human beings in a New Orleans slave market. The specter haunted him for years. As he put it, "Whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally." The Kansas-Nebraska Act and the violence it provoked touched off a political earthquake. Unable to deal with the slavery issue, Lincoln's Whig Party disintegrated beneath his feet. Finding himself politically homeless, he was confronted with a defining choice. Should he join the new anti-slavery Republicans, or should he throw in his lot with the anti-immigrant American Party, popularly dubbed the Know-Nothings for their secretive rituals? "I am not a know-nothing," concluded Lincoln. "This is certain. How could I be? How can anyone who abhors the oppression of Negroes be in favor of degrading classes of white people? Our progress in degeneracy appears to me to be pretty rapid. As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it to all men are created equal except Negroes. When the know-nothings get control, we'll read all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I shall prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty, to Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy." It turns out that immigration as a hot-button issue has been with us for over 150 years. Where logic failed, Lincoln turned to laughter to make his point. "I had an Irishman named Patrick cultivating my garden," he told audiences. "One morning I went out to see how he was getting along. 'Mr. Lincoln, what do you think of these know-nothings?' he asked me. I explained what they were trying to do, and I asked Pat why he had not been born in America. 'Faith,' he replied, 'I wanted to, but my mother would not let me.'" Lincoln never lost his sense of humor, but he learned to redirect it at himself rather than his opponents. He joked about his appearance the way Ronald Reagan joked about his age, disarming opponents while masking ambitions. Before one audience of newspapermen, he professed to feel out of place. "I feel like I once did when I met a woman riding on horseback in the woods," said Lincoln. As I stopped to let her pass, she also stopped and looked at me intently and said, "I do believe you were the ugliest man I ever saw." "Madam," I said, "you are probably right, but I can't help it." "No," she said, "you can't help it, but you might stay at home." In the crucible of the 1850s, his language, like his humor, took on a newfound urgency. It may be hard to believe, once upon a time, American politicians wrote their own sound bites. Lincoln never required the services of a speechwriter or consultant to frame his convictions. In 1858, when he ran for the Senate against Stephen Douglas, he, of course, challenged Douglas to a series of debates over one issue, the overriding moral issue of the day, the spread of slavery into the territories. One afternoon, in anticipation of their first debate, Lincoln sat down and in his own hand scrawled out 3 sentences that really sum up his political creed. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. He was willing by then to risk defeat rather than muffle his conscience. The famous House Divided speech was very controversial. It was an acceptance speech. And he used, of course, the famous metaphor from the book of Matthew, a house divided against itself cannot stand. What he meant was what no one in America wanted to confront. Everyone knew, but no one wanted to say out loud. This nation cannot endure permanently half slave, half free. One way or the other, we will become either all one thing or all the other. His friends, who saw an advanced copy of the speech, begged him to take out that language, and above all, to take out the House Divided reference. And Lincoln refused. Now, you could argue he was already looking down the road to 1860. But he had absolutely no reason at all to see himself at that point as a potential president. What he was a candidate for the Senate who desperately wanted to beat Stephen Douglas, who desperately wanted to be in the United States Senate. And yet, he wasn't so desperate as to suppress even inflammatory language, if that's the language that really expressed his convictions. He was a politician who was outgrowing politics. But he was no abolitionist. He was too much the moderate. And politically, he couldn't afford to be an abolitionist, even if he wanted to. Not in a state where 70% of the electorate favored amending their constitution to exclude all blacks from the soil of Illinois. So Lincoln tailored his words that fall to fit local fashion and sometimes prejudices. In Chicago, he proposed to discard once and for all talk of, quote, inferior people. He criticized the Supreme Court, claiming that its recent ruling against Dred Scott was part of a larger conspiracy to nationalize slavery. Yet to placate downstate bigots, he denied ever favoring social or political equality between the races. He didn't want a Negro slave, insisted Lincoln, any more than a Negro wife. On Election Day, his party received more popular votes, but when the legislature met, it was to re-elect the little giant. It's funny, the Illinois legislature's been doing strange things for a long time. Lincoln had lost an election, but he'd won a national audience. Talk of Lincoln for president began to percolate. Then as now, a candidate's image held the key to his electability. Imagine the scene. It's the state party convention, Republican convention, in the spring of 1860, in Decatur. Lincoln supporters unveil an inspired bit of political theater. By careful prearrangement, the candidate's cousin, John Hanks, came forward carrying a pair of 2 weathered fence rails, allegedly split by his illustrious kinsman. Modestly, Lincoln said that he could not positively identify the rails as being his handiwork, though he was quick to add, "I have split a great many better-looking ones." Thus was born Lincoln the Rail Splitter, surely a more appealing campaign image than Lincoln the Railroad Lawyer. That the candidate himself fully understood modern image-making came through in a conversation he had with the photographer Matthew Brady, in which he said, "My Cooper Union speech and your photographs won me the presidency." With the Union crumbling all around him, Americans turned to their president-elect for some roadmap to the future. He was not inclined to gratify them. To those who would listen in the South, he made conciliatory sounds, except where the spread of slavery was concerned. On that point, he said, "Hold firm as with a chain of steel. The tug has to come, and better now than any time hereafter." In his inaugural address, he vowed to hold, occupy, and possess all federal properties in the South. But very shrewdly, he also shifted the onus from himself to Southern extremists for undertaking aggression and starting a war. "In your hands my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. The man who took the oath of office before the east front of the Capitol in March 1861 was scarcely recognizable to his political cronies back in Illinois. Even before his election, his yearning for advancement had been elevated, if not altogether purified, through a growing involvement with the anti-slavery movement. The war fused the disparate elements of Lincoln's personality into a character of astonishing force and subtlety. Squeezed or bled out of his system was anything that smacked of pettiness, vengeance, or even ego. He did not personalize the conflict, neither did he demonize his enemies. In fact, he pretended the Confederacy didn't exist, and neither did Jefferson Davis. In times like the present, said Lincoln, men should utter nothing for which they would not willingly be responsible through time and eternity. Honoring his pledge to do nothing in malice, he was able to laugh off attacks directed his way by less magnanimous men, many of them in his own party. As he once put it, I've endured a great deal of ridicule without much malice, and have received a great deal of kindness not quite free of ridicule. I'm used to it. One measure of political success is the ability to manipulate men and events to achieve one's ends while concealing one's motives and methods. This is Lincoln. I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me. That's exactly what you would expect a politician to say. In fact, events might control his actions, but in his ability to improvise around those events, Lincoln never lost sight of the bedrock principles for which he was contending. Case in point, in the first few months of his presidency, Lincoln compared himself to a man who was so busy in renting one end of his house that he couldn't stop to put out the fire burning in the other. Following the Confederate assault on Fort Sumter, he called Congress into special session, but not until he personally, on his own authority, summoned armies into the field, declared a blockade of southern ports, and suspended the ancient protection of habeas corpus. It has been a grave question whether any government not too strong for the liberties of its people can be strong enough to maintain its existence in emergencies, said Lincoln. Those words are as relevant today as they were when Lincoln first spoke them. It has been a grave question whether any government not too strong for the liberties of its people can be strong enough to maintain its existence in emergencies. It was a question he was determined to raise, whatever the political uproar it would engender. His action in suspending habeas corpus led critics then and historians since to speak of incipient dictatorship. Anticipating claims that reverberate through today's headlines, Lincoln argued the doctrine of necessity. Unprecedented circumstances authorized him to temporarily suspend a single clause of the Constitution. Just a brief geography lesson. Remember where Washington, D.C. is located. It's between Maryland and Virginia. Virginia had already seceded. Lincoln, in his office, kept a telescope. He could look through that telescope and see Confederates bristling on the hills of Arlington across the Potomac River. In Baltimore, mobs wouldn't let Union troops cross their city to get to Washington. So Washington's like a nut in this nutcracker of Virginia and Maryland. Virginia's already gone. Lincoln cannot afford to lose Maryland. But in fact, there is every indication to believe if he let the Maryland legislature meet, they might very well vote to secede. So what did he do? He suspended habeas corpus and he arrested much of the Maryland legislature. In fact, 13,000 people would ultimately be arrested as a result of the president's suspension of that one clause of the Constitution. The Chief Justice, old Roger Taney, reprimanded him for failing to execute the laws. This is Lincoln's response. Are all the laws but one to go unexecuted? and the government itself to go to pieces, lest that one be violated? Rather than yield to rebels who would trash the entire Constitution, said Lincoln, he would temporarily suspend one clause of the document. And then, being Lincoln, he chose the most pungent of images to convey what he was getting at. This is vintage Lincoln. As he put it, often a limb must be amputated to save a life. But a life is never wisely given to save a limb. Some thought his use of language unpresidential. Traditionalists protested his use of the term sugar-coated in a state paper. The public printer himself came to the White House in a high dudgeon to remind the president of the difference between a message to Congress and an Illinois stump speech. John, said Lincoln, that term expresses precisely my idea, and I'm not going to change it. Sugar-coated must stand. The time will never come in this country when the people will not understand exactly what sugar-coated means. Politics is the art of persuasion. Lincoln understood this better than anyone who's ever been in the White House. Public sentiment, he once said, is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. He was the original great communicator. Was he flawed? Did he make mistakes? Of course. He was human. As a war leader, he can be faulted for some of the generals he chose, or the inordinate amount of time he lavished on a never-ending procession of office seekers. Yet even here, somehow, he maintained his sense of humor, which is another word for sense of perspective. One day there appeared outside his office a group advocating a candidate for commissioner of the Sandwich Islands, what we know as Hawaii. Not only was their candidate qualified for the post, said his friends, he absolutely needed it for the beneficial effects of the Pacific climate on his uncertain health. Lincoln cut them short. Gentlemen, he said, there are 8 other applicants for that position, and they are all sicker than your man. In the autumn of 1863, just returned from Gettysburg, the president learned that he was himself ill, his condition diagnosed as a mild form of smallpox. Moreover, it was contagious. There's one good thing about this, Lincoln told his doctors. Now I have something I can give everyone. Great leaders aren't simply crisis managers. We hear a lot about crisis management. Great leaders use a crisis to establish a bond, an emotional bond with the people they lead, and to bank political credit for the inevitable lean days to come. Think of Winston Churchill in the Battle of Britain. Think of Franklin Roosevelt in March 1933, or Rudy Giuliani in the days right after 9/11. There was never a critical mass of Americans in the North, loyal Americans, who were willing to believe that Lincoln was a dictator in embryo. Why? Because they knew about Lincoln's background. They heard his repeated explanations of the war as a to the death fight for the principle of popular government and for the possibilities in a free labor society that men and women from the most modest of origins could achieve great things. And then they knew how he dealt with his subordinates. To command the Army of the Potomac, Lincoln installed General George McClellan, a better organizer than fighter. Little Mac privately derided his unmilitary commander-in-chief as a guerrilla surrounded by traitors. One evening, Lincoln called at McClellan's home, only to find the general out. When he returned, McClellan pointedly ignored the President of the United States, who was patiently sitting in his parlor. Eventually, a servant appeared to inform Lincoln and his party that the general had retired for the night. You can imagine the reaction of those around Lincoln. This is Lincoln's reaction. I will hold McClellan's horse if he will only bring us success. Some dictator. His cabinet. Edwin Stanton was the Secretary of War. The first Secretary of War was a man named Simon Cameron, a corrupt politician from Pennsylvania, of whom it was said he would steal anything except a red-hot stove. And there was some doubt as to whether he wouldn't steal that. He was a disaster. He had been promised a job by Lincoln's managers at the convention in 1860, and and he turned out to be a disaster. Lincoln sent him as ambassador to Russia, where there are lots of red-hot stoves. Then he had to replace him. Who did he choose? No one would have predicted he would have chosen Edward Stanton. 20 years before, Lincoln and Stanton had met once in Cincinnati in the biggest case of Lincoln's legal career. He got a $5,000 retainer. And he went to Cincinnati. He'd studied and studied and studied. He was all prepared to be part of this team. And Stanton made it very clear that they had no use for this uncouth, raw-boned Westerner, whom he referred to as a guerrilla. And Lincoln heard all this. He had every reason to hold a grudge. Not only did he not hold a grudge, but when the need was greatest, he turned to Edwin Stanton as a man who was ruthless enough to do what the Union cause required. On one occasion, an aide told Lincoln that Stanton had called him a damn fool. This is while he's a member of the president's own family. Other presidents, needless to say, would have considered that remark grounds for dismissal. But Lincoln shrugged it off. If Lincoln said I was a damn fool, then I must be one, for he's nearly always right and generally means what he says. Some dictator. After the Battle of Gettysburg, where General Meade defeated Lee but refused to follow Lee and destroy his army, Lincoln understood by this time the only way this war was going to end. It wasn't about taking Richmond. It was about destroying Confederate armies and destroying the Confederate will to resist. Not all of his generals understood that. He sat down and he wrote a scathing letter to Meade in which he said he was inexpressibly disappointed. The war could have ended, and now it would go on for who knows how long. He finished the letter, and then he put it in his desk. He never sent it. And he gave that advice to Stanton and others. If you get angry, write it out, but file it. He understood there is no authority without moral authority. Victory at the polls can reinforce it, but it cannot create it. As a pragmatist, he was willing throughout the war to adjust tactics and even strategy to attain the ultimate objective. Consider the issue of slavery. Lincoln had long fantasized that African colonization or financial compensation of slaveholders might somehow cut the racial Gordian knot. By the summer of 1862, he knew better. With the war going badly, the time for expedience was past. The master politician had found an issue that could not be finessed. Had he not forecast as much in his House Divided speech 4 years earlier? The same reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason to which he had paid youthful tribute had convinced him that he must do nothing that would alienate Kentucky or the other border states, hostile to emancipation and teetering on the knife's edge of secession. That's what he had believed up until the summer of 1862. Logic told him that it was hypocritical for a nation that professed a love of liberty to keep millions of people in chains. Another kind of logic, that of the battlefield, brought him around to the view that a war over states' rights must ultimately give way to a war for human rights. But he played a shrewd, even secretive game, and he had to. Remember, it wasn't simply the border states that he was afraid of losing. He had no evidence at all that northern armies would fight a war to free black slaves. His commanding general, George McClellan, told him, whatever you do, do not embrace emancipation because this army will melt away. He had to take that into consideration. So when Horace Greeley, the hectoring editor of the New York Herald Tribune, wrote him a public letter demanding emancipation, this is what Lincoln wrote back. I would save the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. But that was for public consumption. Behind the scenes, he was already working on the Emancipation Proclamation, a document that would redefine the war and the nation. In that same letter to Greeley, he also acknowledged a willingness to learn from his mistakes. I shall try to correct errors when shown to be errors, he told the editor, and I shall adopt new views as fast as they shall appear to be true views. New views and true views. That's a forerunner of what he's going to announce in September 1862, that on January 1st, if the South is still in rebellion, he, as a military necessity, will exercise an authority that, quite frankly, no one knew he had, to destroy the institution that provided the underpinning for the rebellion. 1864 was an election year. In those days, presidents and candidates didn't campaign formally. Lincoln used the campaign to educate the public, a war-weary public. The third year of war, going into the fourth year of war, enormous casualties, no end in sight. I tell you, if television had existed in the Lincoln presidency, the war would have been over in about 3 months. We are appalled to know that there are 3,500 casualties in Iraq. U.S. Grant lost 7,000 in 20 minutes at Cold Harbor. And it was Lincoln's job to keep the country united, focused on the ultimate objective. So he used the campaign to do exactly that. To a visiting Ohio regiment at the White House, this is what he said. This is what they were fighting for. This is the meaning of the war. I happened temporarily to occupy this big white house, said Lincoln. I am a living witness that any one of your children may look to come here as my father's child has. It is in order that each one of you may have an open field and a fair chance, that you may all have equal privileges in the race of life. It is for this the struggle should be maintained, that we may not lose our birthright. Victory in November was especially sweet, since his opponent was none other than General George B. McClellan. Frederick Douglass did not exaggerate when he said the last days of Mr. Lincoln were his best days. In the first weeks of 1865, the president twisted just enough arms in Congress to get passed by a 3-vote margin the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which took the Emancipation Proclamation and wrote it into the organic law of the land, abolishing slavery forever on American soil. Illinois was the first state to ratify. To say that Lincoln grew in office is to underestimate his true achievement. Long before his final visit to Ford's Theater, his life had become a parable of sacrifice, not success, as the world measures it. In his growing spirituality, Lincoln did not, like some modern-day politicians, presume to know God's agenda. Still less did he arrogate to himself the role of national theologian. It's been my experience, he once mused, that folks who have no vices generally have few virtues. Nevertheless, when he delivered his second inaugural on March 4th, 1865, it was a sermon on the meaning of the war and the necessity of divine retribution. Listen to his words. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. The name of Thomas B. Bryan is forever associated with this college and this community. It was Bryan who secured from Lincoln the original draft of the Emancipation Proclamation in order to benefit the Chicago Soldiers' Home. Later, the document found its way to the Chicago Historical Society, where it was lost in the Great Fire of 1871. The paper may be gone, but the words remain. So does the example of a politician who had long since buried youthful ambition in causes larger than self and moral issues transcending mere partisan advantage. If the rail splitter retains an undiminished power to move, inspire, and occasionally shame us, perhaps it is because in his permanent campaign we can see reflected back many of our own ambitions, uncertainties, and drives. Out of his fiery trial emerged a soldier of freedom, for whom preserving the Union supplied both a unity of purpose and a ticket to that secular immortality he had first glimpsed as a boy spellbound by Weems' Life of Washington. In the end, the great black scholar W.E.B. Du Bois said it best when he said of Lincoln, "I love him not because he was perfect, but because he was not, and yet triumphed." Please remember that the next time you are tempted to throw up your hands in despair over the course of American politics and the conduct of American politicians. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I will reiterate, I cannot thank you enough. This has been a marvelous evening for me. It's been a wonderful visit, and boy, I hope I have a chance to come back someday. Thanks so much, and happy 50th anniversary to the museum.